Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we delve into powerful tales of transformation, love, and redemption. Today's story follows Ethan Carter, a wealthy businessman whose world of control and arrogance is upended by a woman who challenges everything he thought he knew about life, love, and himself. Stay with us for a journey filled with heartbreak, self-discovery, and the extraordinary power of change. Ethan Carter had it all: a sprawling penthouse in Manhattan, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as one of the sharpest business minds in the country. He was the kind of man who thrived on competition. Whether it was closing a high-stakes business deal or charming the most beautiful woman in the room, his confidence bordered on arrogance. But he'd argue that his track record justified it. Ethan didn't just play the game, he won it. Every time. That's why, on the crisp evening of a charity gala at a luxurious Manhattan hotel, Ethan stood with a self-assured grin as he clinked glasses with his closest friend, Ryan Hayes. Ryan was one of the few people who could match Ethan's sharp wit, though his charm leaned more toward mischief than business acumen. The two had known each other since college, where friendly competition had blossomed into a camaraderie that often teetered on rivalry. As the evening wore on and the champagne flowed, Ryan's grin turned sly, the kind of smile that always preceded one of his provocative challenges. "Ethan," he began, swirling his glass lazily, "you've conquered the business world, charmed half of New York's socialites, and built an empire. But tell me this, are you willing to take on a challenge that's not about money or power?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "Since when do you think I'd pass up a good challenge?" Ryan smirked and leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like a secret. "I bet you wouldn't have the guts to marry someone who doesn't fit your usual type." The statement hung in the air, the weight of its audacity drawing Ethan's full attention. He straightened his posture, his interest peaked. "What's the prize?" he asked, his tone carrying the subtle edge of a man who never played a game without stakes. "$1 million, Ryan replied, raising his glass as though to toast the absurdity of his own proposition. "But here's the catch. You have to marry her and stay married for 6 months." The idea was ludicrous, a challenge so outrageous that Ethan couldn't help but laugh at first. But then Ryan dropped the name, Jessica Walker. Ethan vaguely recognized her, a woman whose confidence and independence made her stand out in any room, but who didn't conform to the traditional mold of what society deemed beautiful. She was sharp, unyielding, and, by all accounts, not the kind of woman who would be swayed by charm or wealth. For Ethan, the bet wasn't about Jessica. It was about his own pride, his unshakable belief that he could succeed at anything, no matter how unconventional. He accepted without hesitation, sealing the deal with a firm handshake and a playful glint in his eye. For Ryan, the stakes were entertainment. For Ethan, it was another game to win. The days that followed were a flurry of planning, or rather, orchestrating. Ryan, ever the instigator, arranged the meeting between Ethan and Jessica. Ethan approached it as he would a business negotiation, meticulously strategizing every detail. Yet when the day arrived, sitting in the upscale restaurant with its dim lighting and crisp linen tablecloths, Ethan found himself caught off guard. Jessica walked in with a quiet confidence that didn't need the validation of the opulent surroundings. She wasn't wearing the kind of high-end fashion Ethan's previous dates often flaunted. Instead, she wore a simple but elegant dress, her posture upright and her expression composed. When their eyes met, Ethan offered his trademark smile, one designed to disarm and charm. But Jessica didn't falter. She returned his gaze with a firmness that made him sit up straighter. "You must be Ethan Carter," she said, her voice calm but carrying a note of challenge. "And you must be Jessica Walker." Ethan replied smoothly, extending a hand. Jessica hesitated for the briefest moment before shaking it, her grip firm enough to match the tone of her introduction. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "Let's not beat around the bush," she began, her tone sharp yet not unkind. "I know why we're here. I know about the bet, the terms, and the conditions." Ethan's carefully crafted facade barely faltered, but internally, He reeled. He hadn't expected such bluntness. And yet you still agreed to meet me, he said, his curiosity genuine despite himself. Why? Jessica paused, her gaze unwavering. Let's just say I have my reasons. 6 months may seem short, but a lot can happen in that time. And if you think you can manipulate or control me, you're mistaken. Her words weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of self-assuredness that Ethan found both intriguing and disarming. As their conversation unfolded, Ethan realized that Jessica was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or status, nor was she interested in the superficial trappings of his world. She was sharp, unyielding, and unapologetically herself, a stark contrast to the women he was accustomed to. The dinner ended with an agreement. They would proceed with the marriage, fulfilling the terms of the bet. But it wasn't lost on Ethan that Jessica had set the tone for their arrangement. She would not be controlled. It was an unexpected twist, one that left him intrigued and unsettled in equal measure. In the days leading up to the wedding, Ethan couldn't shake Jessica from his mind. She wasn't the most conventionally attractive woman he'd ever met, but there was something about her presence, her refusal to bend to the world around her, that captivated him. It was a new kind of challenge, one that felt less like a game and more like uncharted territory. The wedding itself was a quiet, almost clinical affair, held in a small courthouse. It lacked the grandeur that typically accompanied Ethan's milestones. Jessica arrived alone, her simple dress a reflection of her no-nonsense approach to life. Ethan, ever the strategist, wore a sharp suit and a carefully measured smile. As they exchanged vows, Ethan couldn't help but notice the calm resolve in Jessica's eyes. She wasn't nervous, nor did she appear to harbor any illusions about what their arrangement meant. After the ceremony, Ethan brought Jessica to his penthouse, a sprawling space that overlooked the glittering Manhattan skyline. It was a monument to his success, a place where he'd celebrated countless victories. But as Jessica stepped inside, she didn't exude the awe or admiration he had expected. Instead, she walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city with an expression he couldn't quite read. 6 months. Ethan, she said, her voice steady. Not a day more. Ethan smiled, confident as ever. We'll see, he replied, already strategizing how he'd win her over. But as the first days of their marriage unfolded, it became clear that Jessica wasn't like the others. She wasn't impressed by the designer clothes or the luxurious trips. She insisted on keeping her modest routines, politely declining Ethan's attempts to dazzle her with wealth. It wasn't long before Ethan began to feel the first hints of frustration. Jessica's independence wasn't just a trait, it was a barrier, one that Ethan couldn't easily breach. Yet, to his surprise, he found himself drawn to her not in spite of it, but because of it. For the first time, Ethan wasn't entirely in control, and the realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. What had started as a game was becoming something far more complicated, and though he wouldn't admit it, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he'd finally met his match. The days that followed their wedding were a mix of awkward silences and guarded interactions. Ethan Carter, used to commanding every room he walked into, found himself navigating unfamiliar territory. Jessica Walker wasn't just unimpressed by his world. She seemed completely indifferent to it. Ethan had married women figuratively before, women who fawned over his success, who saw him as their golden ticket. But Jessica was different. She wasn't playing into his game, and that made her unpredictable. Ethan thrived on control, yet he couldn't find the right levers to pull with her. And it wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. Jessica, meanwhile, remained a fortress of quiet confidence. She had agreed to the bet. Yes, but she wasn't going to let Ethan dictate the terms. From the moment she entered his penthouse, she set her boundaries. She didn't move into the master bedroom, opting instead for a guest room with its plain decor and modest size. Ethan had laughed at first, assuming it was some form of reverse psychology. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that Jessica wasn't trying to manipulate him. She simply wasn't interested in being swayed by opulence. One morning, Ethan decided it was time to shake things up He invited Jessica to an exclusive gala, a high-profile event where New York's elite would gather. It was his arena, the place where he shone brightest. If she saw him in his element, surrounded by admirers and allies, surely she'd begin to see his worth, or so he thought. Jessica's response was calm but firm. "I'm not a trophy, Ethan. I'm not going to stand at your side just to make you look good." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's not about that," he argued. "It's about being part of my life, understanding what I do." She looked at him then, her gaze piercing. "Is it? Or is it about proving something to yourself?" Her words cut deeper than he expected. For the first time, Ethan felt a crack in his confidence, though he masked it with a dismissive shrug. "Suit yourself," he said coolly, walking away. But her refusal stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his pride. Jessica wasn't oblivious to Ethan's frustration. She saw how he tried to impress her with extravagant gestures, designer clothes delivered to her door, reservations at the city's most exclusive restaurants, impromptu trips to the Hamptons. But she turned them all down, her refusals polite but resolute. She knew what he was doing, and she wasn't interested in being part of his game. For Jessica, the marriage was a contract, one she had entered into with clear eyes and a purpose she had yet to reveal. She wasn't here to play the role of a submissive wife, nor was she interested in bending to Ethan's will. If anything, she wanted to test his limits, to see how far his arrogance would stretch before it snapped. The tension between them reached a boiling point one evening when Ethan, frustrated by her unyielding independence, confronted her in the penthouse's sprawling living room. "Why are you even here, Jessica?" he demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "You don't care about the money, and you clearly don't care about me. So what's the point?" Jessica, seated calmly on the couch, looked up at him with the same composure she always carried. "That's a good question, Ethan. Maybe you should ask yourself why you care so much about my approval." Her response left him momentarily speechless. She wasn't angry, nor did she raise her voice. She simply held a mirror to his insecurities. And for a man like Ethan, that was more unsettling than any argument could be. "Let me make one thing clear," she continued, her tone unwavering. "I'm not here to be molded into your idea of a perfect partner. I agreed to this arrangement on my terms, not yours, and I have no intention of letting you dictate how I live my life." Ethan stared at her, his frustration giving way to a grudging respect. Jessica wasn't just resisting him. She was challenging him in a way no one ever had. It wasn't just infuriating, it was intriguing. From that night on, Ethan began to see Jessica differently. He watched her closely, not in the way he observed competitors or potential business partners, but with a curiosity that bordered on admiration. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve. And for a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, that was both fascinating and humbling. Jessica, for her part, remained steadfast. She went about her days with a quiet determination, unbothered by Ethan's wealth or status. She didn't flinch when he flaunted his power, nor did she soften when he tried to charm her. But beneath her stoic exterior, she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in Ethan's demeanor. He was starting to listen more, to observe rather than command. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her wonder if there was more to him than the arrogant facade he presented to the world. One afternoon, Ethan joined her in the kitchen as she brewed a pot of tea, a simple, unremarkable moment that felt strangely significant. "Why tea?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. "Most people in this city are fueled by coffee." Jessica glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Tea slows you down," she replied. "It forces you to be present." Ethan frowned, considering her words. Presence wasn't something he valued. His life was a constant race to the next victory, the next milestone. Yet here was Jessica, savoring the act of brewing tea as though it were a ritual. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of curiosity about something beyond his own ambition. He didn't say anything, but he stayed in the kitchen as Jessica poured her tea, watching the way she moved with deliberate care. It was in these small, quiet moments that something began to shift between them. The tension was still there, but it no longer felt as sharp. There was a growing sense of mutual respect, a tentative understanding that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Ethan couldn't explain why, but he found himself looking forward to these moments with Jessica. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known, unimpressed by his achievements, unshaken by his power, and unafraid to call him out on his flaws. For a man who had spent his entire life at the top, Jessica was a reminder that there were some things money couldn't buy. And for Jessica, Ethan was beginning to reveal glimpses of vulnerability, cracks in the armor of arrogance that she hadn't expected. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she couldn't deny the possibility that beneath his bravado, there might be a man worth knowing. As the weeks passed, the lines between their roles began to blur. What had started as a bet was becoming something more, a collision of two worlds, two egos, and two hearts that were beginning to see each other in a new light. But neither of them was ready to admit it. Not yet. They were still playing the game, even if the rules were starting to change. Weeks turned into a month, and the dynamics between Ethan and Jessica continued to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. For Ethan, it was a strange experience. He, who had always been at the center of every relationship, now found himself orbiting Jessica, watching her with a mixture of fascination and frustration. She was a riddle, one he couldn't quite solve, and yet he found himself drawn to her more and more. Jessica, on the other hand, was unwavering in her approach. She maintained her routines, her boundaries, and her quiet independence. She knew Ethan was trying to understand her, but she wasn't ready to let him in, not yet. There was too much at stake, too much history that couldn't be erased by simple gestures or fleeting moments of connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jessica suggested they take a walk in Central Park. It was a rare invitation, and Ethan, eager to break the monotony of their guarded interactions, agreed. The park was alive with the colors of fall, the air crisp and filled with the chatter of families, joggers, and tourists. Jessica seemed at ease here, her pace steady, her gaze thoughtful as they strolled beneath the canopy of golden leaves. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys being outdoors," Ethan remarked, his tone teasing but curious. Jessica smirked, her lips curving just enough to suggest amusement. "And you don't strike me as someone who notices the changing seasons," she replied, glancing at him briefly before continuing. "But here we are." Ethan chuckled, the sound light and genuine. "Fair point. I guess I've been too busy chasing deals to pay attention." Jessica stopped walking then, turning to face him with a piercing gaze. "That's the problem. Ethan, you're always chasing something: money, power, approval. Have you ever stopped to think about why?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He could have deflected, could have made a witty remark to shift the focus away from himself. But something about Jessica's expression stopped him. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet curiosity that made him feel unexpectedly vulnerable. "I guess," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've always believed that success defines a person. If you're not moving forward, you're falling behind." Jessica nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "And what happens when there's nothing left to chase? When you've reached the top and there's no one left to compete with?" Ethan hesitated, her question striking a nerve he hadn't even realized was there. The truth was, he didn't know. His entire life had been a relentless pursuit of more money, more recognition, more victories. The idea of stopping, of simply being, felt foreign to him. As they continued their walk, Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told Jessica about his childhood, about growing up in a household where success was the only thing that mattered. His father, a self-made businessman, had drilled into him the importance of ambition and resilience, often at the expense of kindness and empathy. Jessica listened without interrupting, her gaze steady and thoughtful. She didn't offer platitudes or sympathy, but her silence spoke volumes. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt truly heard. When they returned to the penthouse, the atmosphere between them felt lighter, almost companionable. Ethan, emboldened by the progress they seemed to be making, decided to push a little further. That evening, over a quiet dinner, he asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since the day they met. "Jessica," he began, his tone careful, "why did you agree to this? You're not the kind of person who would be swayed by money or a deal. So why did you say yes?" Jessica looked at him then, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might brush him off or change the subject. But instead, she set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Because I saw an opportunity," she said simply. "An opportunity to teach you something, to make you see the world differently." Ethan frowned, her answer vague but intriguing. "And what is it you're trying to teach me?" Jessica smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "That life isn't just a series of transactions, Ethan. That people aren't pawns to be moved around for your benefit." Her words stung, but Ethan knew she wasn't wrong. He had spent most of his life viewing relationships as strategic alliances, as tools to further his ambitions. But with Jessica, he couldn't help but feel that the stakes were different. She wasn't just a participant in his game. She was the one rewriting the rules. That night, as Ethan lay awake in his room, he couldn't stop replaying their conversation in his mind. Jessica's words had planted a seed of doubt, forcing him to question not only his approach to their arrangement, but his entire way of life. For the first time, he wondered if winning this bet was really the goal, or if the real victory would be proving Jessica wrong. Meanwhile, Jessica sat in her own room, her thoughts heavy with the weight of her secrets. She had been careful not to reveal too much, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The memories of her father's company, of the devastating loss that had shattered her family, were never far from her mind. Every time she looked at Ethan, she saw the man who had destroyed her father's dreams, even if he didn't remember the specifics. But as much as she wanted to make Ethan pay for what he had done, she couldn't deny the small, quiet moments of connection that were beginning to form between them. It was a complication she hadn't anticipated, and it left her feeling conflicted. Could she continue with her plan knowing that Ethan was starting to change? Or was this newfound understanding between them simply another part of the game? The next morning, Jessica woke early and found Ethan in the kitchen, already brewing coffee. He looked up as she entered, offering her a tentative smile. "Good morning," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Tea or coffee?" Jessica raised an eyebrow, surprised by the gesture. "Tea," she replied, watching as he set about preparing it with a level of care she hadn't expected. As they sat together in the quiet of the morning, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. Jessica, with her unyielding strength and quiet resolve, was unlike anyone he had ever known. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew one thing for certain: this bet was no longer just about winning. It was about something far more important, something he was only beginning to grasp. The weeks passed in a rhythm neither Ethan nor Jessica had anticipated. The sharp edges of their interactions softened, though the tension still lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. For Ethan, the shift was both unsettling and strangely invigorating. Jessica's presence in his life wasn't just challenging, it was transformative. She was the first person who had ever forced him to confront the cracks in his carefully constructed world. But Jessica wasn't without her own internal struggle. Every day, she reminded herself why she had agreed to this arrangement. She hadn't entered this bet out of curiosity or ambition. It was personal. Ethan Carter had ruined her father's business, an act of corporate greed that had devastated her family and led to years of hardship. Her father's death, though not directly caused by Ethan, had been the inevitable result of the despair Ethan's actions had sown. Jessica had entered this marriage with a plan: to make Ethan understand what it felt like to lose control, to feel powerless against forces greater than himself. And yet, as time went on, she found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the man before her with the one she had blamed for so long. Ethan wasn't what she had expected. Yes, he was arrogant, controlling, and frustratingly self-assured. But he was also capable of surprising vulnerability, and that vulnerability was beginning to complicate her resolve. One evening, as the city lights sparkled through the penthouse windows, Ethan sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey in hand. Jessica entered the room, a book tucked under her arm, and hesitated for a moment before joining him. It was the kind of unspoken truce they had begun to establish, an acknowledgement that their shared space didn't have to be a battlefield. "You've been quiet today," Ethan remarked, his voice low and contemplative. Jessica glanced at him, surprised by the shift in his tone. He sounded less like the cocky businessman she had married and more like a man searching for something he couldn't name. "Just thinking," she replied, settling into the armchair opposite him. "About what?" She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to share the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind all day. But something about the way Ethan was looking at her, curious, open, made her decide to take the risk. "About how people change," she said finally, "and whether it's ever truly possible." Ethan frowned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Do you think people can't?" "I think most people don't," Jessica replied, her gaze steady. "It's easier to stay the same, to keep repeating the same patterns. Real change takes effort, and not everyone is willing to put in that effort." Ethan considered her words, his thoughts drifting to the version of himself he had been just months ago. He couldn't deny that Jessica's presence in his life was pushing him to see things differently. But was he truly changing? Or was he just pretending, hoping to win her approval and, by extension, the bet? "What about you?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Do you think I can change?" Jessica didn't answer right away. She studied him, her expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "I think the fact that you're asking that question is a start." Ethan wasn't sure if her answer was a compliment or a challenge, but it left him with a strange sense of hope. For the first time, he felt that Jessica wasn't entirely closed off to him. There was a flicker of possibility, a crack in the wall she had so carefully built around herself. The following day, Ethan decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to impress Jessica with grand gestures, he focused on the small things, the details she valued but rarely mentioned. He noticed the way she lingered over the flowers at the market during one of their rare outings, her fingers brushing over the soft petals of peonies. He remembered how she always chose a seat by the window in cafes, her gaze drawn to the world outside. And he noted how her favorite tea wasn't just about the flavor, but the ritual of making it. That evening, Ethan returned to the penthouse with a small bouquet of peonies. He didn't hand them to Jessica directly, knowing she would see it as a ploy. Instead, he left them on the kitchen counter, unassuming and without a note. He didn't even stay in the room to see her reaction, though he couldn't stop himself from watching from the corner of his eye as she discovered them. Jessica paused when she saw the flowers, her expression carefully neutral. She reached out, her fingers brushing the soft pink petals, and for a moment, a flicker of something softer crossed her face. She didn't say anything, but she didn't discard the flowers either. For Ethan, that was enough. The small gestures continued in the days that followed. Ethan made an effort to meet Jessica where she was rather than trying to pull her into his world. He brewed her tea in the mornings, set out her favorite book when she left it behind, and even suggested a walk in the park one weekend, knowing how much she valued the calm of nature. Jessica noticed the shift, though she didn't acknowledge it out loud. She wasn't ready to let her guard down completely, but she couldn't deny that Ethan's actions felt genuine. It wasn't just about the bed anymore. He was trying, and that effort mattered more than she wanted to admit. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Ethan turned to Jessica with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Why do you keep fighting so hard to keep me at arm's length?" he asked, his voice quiet but earnest. "I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying. Doesn't that count for something?" Jessica's chest tightened at his words. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was sincerity. For a moment, she considered telling him everything about her father, about the business Ethan had destroyed, about the pain that had shaped her life. But she wasn't ready. "Not yet. It's not about keeping you at arm's length," she said finally. "It's about protecting myself. I've been hurt before, Ethan, more than you can imagine, and I'm not sure I can go through that again." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Ethan nodded, his gaze softening. I understand, he said simply. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm not that man anymore. Jessica didn't respond, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan was capable of becoming the man she needed him to be. But the path forward wouldn't be easy, and the secret she still held threatened to unravel everything they had begun to build. The turning point came on a night when the city was unusually quiet, its usual buzz muffled by an autumn rain. Jessica sat by the penthouse window, the sound of raindrops pattering against the glass a soothing backdrop to her swirling thoughts. Across the room, Ethan watched her, sensing the weight of something unsaid. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with an unspoken understanding, a fragile truce that neither wanted to break. But Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that Jessica was holding something back, a truth she wasn't ready to share. He had seen glimpses of it in her eyes, heard it in the moments her voice wavered. The curiosity that had initially driven him to win her over now shifted into something deeper, a need to truly know her. He approached cautiously, standing a few feet away before speaking. "Jessica," he began, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "There's something you're not telling me. I can feel it." Jessica turned her head slightly, her expression guarded. "What makes you think that?" Ethan took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I know you well enough now to see when you're holding back. And I don't want there to be walls between us anymore. If there's something you need to say, I'm ready to hear it." Jessica's chest tightened. She had anticipated this moment, even dreaded it, but she hadn't expected it to come with such an air of sincerity. For weeks, she had wrestled with the decision to tell Ethan the truth. Part of her wanted to let him in, to share the burden she had carried for so long. But another part of her feared that revealing her pain would destroy whatever fragile progress they had made. She turned back to the window, her reflection a ghostly outline against the rain-soaked glass. "It's not something you'll want to hear," she said finally. "Maybe not," Ethan replied, stepping closer. "But I think I need to." Jessica closed her eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. When she spoke, her voice was steady but laced with emotion. "Do you remember a company called Walker Industries?" Ethan frowned, the name stirring a faint memory. Vaguely, he admitted. "It was a small manufacturing firm, wasn't it? I think it went under years ago." "It didn't just go under." "Ethan," Jessica said, her tone sharpening. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and anger. "You destroyed it." Ethan's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "My father owned Walker Industries," Jessica said, each word cutting like a blade. "It wasn't a Fortune 500 company, but it was his life's work. He built it from the ground up, put everything he had into it. And then you came along." Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of a deal he had barely remembered. "Jessica, You bought out his suppliers," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "You undercut his contracts, spread rumors that his business was failing. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. He lost everything. And do you know what happened next?" Ethan shook his head, his throat dry. "No," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "He killed himself," Jessica said, her voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "He couldn't face the shame, the failure. My mother and I were left with nothing. No home, no support, nothing but the debt you left behind." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the weight of her words. Ethan felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had always prided himself on being ruthless in business, on playing the game better than anyone else. But he had never truly considered the human cost of his actions. "Jessica," he began, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't mean." "You didn't know because you didn't care," Jessica said, her tears now streaming freely. "People like you never do. You see numbers, not lives. You thrive on taking, no matter who it hurts." Ethan couldn't speak. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and shame, his usual confidence replaced by a crushing sense of regret. He had always thought of himself as a winner, but now he realized the price of his victories, the lives he had ruined, the dreams he had shattered. I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose everything. Jessica continued, her voice firm despite her tears. To be powerless, to have your world taken from you. That's why I agreed to this marriage. It wasn't about the money or the bed. It was about making you see. Ethan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I don't know how to make this right, he admitted. His voice choked with emotion. I don't know if I can. Jessica stood silently, watching him. Part of her felt vindicated, seeing the man who had caused her so much pain brought to his knees. But another part of her felt an unexpected ache. She had expected him to deny it, to defend himself. But instead, he looked utterly broken, and despite everything, she couldn't ignore the change she had begun to see in him. You can't fix the past, Jessica said softly, but you can decide what kind of man you want to be moving forward. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. I don't want to be the man who hurt you, he said. I want to be better. For you. For myself. Jessica didn't respond right away. She turned back to the window, the rain blurring the city lights beyond. For the first time, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope, not for redemption, but for the possibility of change. As the night wore on, neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them was different now. It was no longer a barrier, but a bridge, fragile and uncertain, waiting to be crossed. Ethan had been forced to confront his past, and Jessica had begun to let go of the anger that had defined her for so long. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, both of them were willing to take it together, not as adversaries, but as two people searching for a way forward together. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Ethan and Jessica's story reminds us that even the most broken relationships can offer a path to redemption when empathy and effort are at the heart of it. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more captivating narratives. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep embracing empathy